aggressive statements that Trump has let out after his election in the context of Greenland, in the context of Canada, in the context of Panama, and of course, tariff seems to be his major passionate issue. So he's already announced 10% tax on China, 10%, 2.5% as a general tariff across the board. And in fact, the Secretary of State says it will keep increasing every frequently till such time they get what they want. And more importantly, 25% tariffs have been imposed on Mexico, Canada, and some of his allies. So there is a fair amount of churning that's taking place across the world on how to handle this maverick president. And if you look at some of the experts like Richard Wolff or Michael Hudson or even the Jeff Rich from Australia, all of them are saying that Trump is not going the right way, because if you really want to arrest America's decline, there is a different approach that he needs to take, particularly from the context of what kind of a world that he wants to actually accommodate and live with, not just dominate everybody else. But the major questions that were raised as Trump came into the elections was, will he resolve the Ukrainian problem? Will he sort out the Middle East or West Asian issues? These are still, questions that are hanging in the balance. But one good development has been the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, which has led to exchange of prisoners. Where does India stand in this new Trump's aggressive approach to make America great again? Is it going to be at the cost of others, or is it going to be live with others and then accommodate others? So with these initial inputs, let me request Ambassador Sood to give us the initial comments. Ambassador Sood.
Thank you. Thank you, Marshal. Let me first of all thank you for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. There is going to be a difference in Trump 2.0, because if we go back, even Trump probably did not think that he was going to win the election the last time around. So if you remember, when he formed his, he didn't have loyalist advisors lining up, and therefore he went to the conventional Republican conservative people, including a number of people from the services, senior generals and so on, and all of that. And they kind of acted as a constraint. This time, as soon as the election results were out, there was a queue of people visiting Mar-a-Lago, loyalists. So therefore, this time around, he has been able to put together his cabinet, his advisors, and so on, well before he entered White House, which means that there is going to be less of a constraint in that sense. So the administration will move a little more smoothly. Of course, he also has the benefit this time around of a Congress and a Senate, which he more or less, or the Republican Party controls, but then most of the people are backing. So that's point one. Second point, in his first term, if you recall, he deprived India of GSP. He also put pressure on us, and we stopped buying any Iranian oil or Venezuelan oil. So many of these things, even though we could take comfort in the fact that he emphasized the Indo-Pacific and Quad and things like that, but we have our own position on the Quad. We don't want to see it emerge as a security alliance. We have, in fact, been somewhat reticent. We would like to be able to play between China and the US. Now, Trump's approach is that he likes to show that he is the winner in any deal making or in any negotiation, that he is the numero uno, so to say. That is a little bit difficult. And therefore, the equation that is going to be the most critical is going to be the US-China equation. Um, the Chinese last time around, they played it their own way. When Trump imposed tariffs, there were trade wars, but Biden has taken it forward. And now there is a whole, the deep state, let us say, in the United States, is convinced that China is the key rival and there has to be the lead the US has to increase. China needs to be constrained in, through trade measures, through sanctions, through preventing access to technology, etc., etc. Trump doesn't want to get into a war, either a shooting war or any other kind of war. He would like to do a deal. Now, will the Chinese take advantage of knowing this? Because for the Chinese have also studied him and dealt with him. After all, Xi Jinping was there the last time around, and he has been there through the thing. So he's an experienced guy. And you come to Putin. That's the other thing. I mean, there again, if you remember, day before yesterday, he spoke about arms control and things like that because the new START expires next year in February, 1 year from now, and there are no talks taking place. And while at that stage Putin responded positively, he then came up with a second statement talking about the Iron Dome and the missile shield, to which the Russians, I mean, how the hell are the Russians going to get into arms control if the US is going to be investing in an Iron Dome missile shield kind of a system? And then he also wants to bring in China into it. So the thing is that he is looking at it not from the point of view of any ideology. He is looking at it in terms of, therefore, with an ideology, you can have a debate. And you don't have an ideology and you're basically be engaging in disruption, then it becomes very difficult to engage in a debate. So we will have to tread waters somewhat carefully in terms of finding our feet with this new administration, which is going to be acting unpredictably, but in a much more unconstrained fashion as compared to the last time around. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. That's absolutely correct. No ideology and a disruptive approach is, as Robert Kaplan is just 2 days ago has mentioned, it's going to lead to chaos, is what he believes. Mohan, how do you look at from the economics angle? Because just a day before, in a Canadian economist, Taylor Kenny says very clearly that the collapse of the dollar is inevitable. And she says four reasons. One is the unsustainable US debt of 36 trillion. Second is the weaponization of the dollar that has actually taken away any leftover trust in the US system across the world. And then third, that also leads to nations now being concerned that holding dollar reserves is a big risk, and therefore they want to reduce that. Third is, of course, geopolitical alliances that are transforming. Indonesia has become a BRICS member, and that's created a fair amount of discussions on the net as well. And fourth is technological advancement. The cryptocurrencies or the central bank digital currency transactions are going to change completely. And she says, no more will there ever be a single reserve currency across the world. So is Trump actually living in a dream of his own when he says he'll make America great again and rich again? If the dollar is not going to be the reserve currency, if it continues to reduce, and she says it's going to be rapid decline now, what would be the future? And how will it impact in terms of our policies with respect to our own economic strategies?
In 2000, the dollar accounted for 71% of global reserves. And in 2025, it's down to about 60%. So quietly, the dollar is dwindling as the global reserve in percentage terms. In actuality, it might be going up. But it only means that the global reliance, confidence in the dollar is coming down slowly. Because all of us are invested in the dollar. It's just not the Americans who are invested in the dollar. We Indians are, for instance, holding $650 billion as reserves. Chinese hold 3 billion. The Russians hold over 1 billion. The Japanese hold 2 billion. Saudis, all of us are invested in dollars. So, we can't also allow the dollar to run down. And the dollar, for all the vagaries which take place in America, is a currency which enjoys general confidence in the world. Whether you're individual salting away money abroad or, keeping money, not changing your money back when you come back, we all salt it in dollars. So it's a global currency. So it's very difficult. Would you want to hold it in yuan? For instance, after my Chinese visits, I've got a few thousand yuan left around. I don't know what to do with it. No bank will accept it. Whereas any bank, any money changer will accept a dollar. In the old city, I can go and say, will you take the dollar? They take it. But there's a degree of confidence which has come after World War II, which after Bretton Woods, which was made the dollar this global central currency. Dollar was not intended to be the global reserve currency. Lord Keynes and the others wanted a global currency called Bancor as a global reserve currency, but the Americans refused to do it. And interestingly enough, the American economist who put his foot down was a man called White. Ambassador White, who was their main economics negotiator at Bretton Woods, said no. And later on, a few years ago, it was discovered that Ambassador White was actually a Soviet double. So what game Stalin was playing, we don't know. But whether Stalin wanted a global currency or didn't want one, we don't know. But the fact is that the Americans emerged as the dollar being the king. And now it is slowly dwindling. The dollar used to be linked to gold in 1974. In 1974, Nixon delinked the dollar. As a result, the Americans have discovered that you can print any number of dollars. And since only the Americans can print dollars, apart from the informal printing which takes place in Karachi and a few other places, they are progressively devaluing the dollar, but themselves, by living beyond their means. The American dream is sustained by living beyond their means. Their average individual debt, credit card debt alone in the United States is 5.3 trillion. Just credit card debt. So, how long will this continue? We don't know. Logic says it has to end sooner or later. Will it end with a bang or will it end gradually as we're seeing now? It is ending. But what Trump is intending to do is to preserve that hegemony of the dollar. And he's warning BRICS now, saying BRICS has got this long-term goal of currency swaps, trading in each other's currency. That is, we pay the Chinese in rupees, the Chinese pay us in yuan, etc., and we balance our trade and keep swapping in our own currency. They are already doing it with the Russians. We're the only one out of that game in BRICS. And we might join. And the second warning which Trump gave after becoming president is that I will not let BRICS do it. I will come bearing down like thunder on them. And this is what he means, because it affects the primacy of the dollar. And so he will do all kinds of things to preserve that hegemony of the dollar. Whether it was Biden or whether it's Trump or whether it was Obama, the preservation of the dollar as the reserve currency, as the global currency, as the currency for trade, is on what their primacy depends. Their soft power. This is their soft power. That we all accept the Americans, institutions, banking institutions, central bank as the main institution to take care of our manage the global economy. Now, Trump is trying to reverse the historical trend. Whether he'll succeed, we don't know. But everything he's doing is only disturbing that international equanimity. He says, I'll occupy Panama because we paid for helping build it the first time. Now, if he occupies the Panama Canal, which I'm sure is technically feasible for the Americans because it's right in their backyard and US Marines and Navy can easily occupy it. And what will happen in South China Seas? What happens to the notion of global commons, of free sea lanes? Then, if you're committed to occupying, will the Chinese keep quiet? Will the Chinese leave Taiwan alone? So there will be tit for tat responses everywhere. And the Chinese have shown they have the ability to launch a maritime response anywhere in the world now, at least in their backyard. If the Americans do it in their backyard, the Chinese will do it in their backyard. If US gets extended in its backyard, then they will not be free to extend themselves to the Chinese backyard. So we've got to see how this shapes out. Whether, like a bully, whether he'll carry it out, one doesn't know. I'm skeptical whether he'll carry out the occupation of Panama. He might try to do a Noriega on the Panamanian president. But, otherwise also, the rest of the globe is also hugely invested in the well-being of Panama because, all our global elites operate through Panama, whether it is Boris Johnson or James Cameron or our Indian billionaires, all of them keep their money. Amitabh Bachchan, they're all in the Panama Papers. They're all found to have accounts in Panama. So whether that stability will be disturbed, what will the consequences of that, we don't know. But one can guess. So whether he will do that, I'm still not very sure. But let's see how it happens. But he's roiling the global system. And today, Trudeau said that he will not let the American tariff pass unanswered. He says if the Americans put 25%, we also know how to strike back. And we are ready for it. This is not something where he says, I'm going to back off. The Mexicans will not back off. The Chinese, of course, will not back off ever. Because the Chinese game is the American game, make China great again. The Chinese believe that they were global number one. They want to be global number one again. So only we are the odd ones out of this game we are watching. We are bystanders while this drama is unfolding around us. And how it will play for India can be anybody's guess. But, Modi, I think, is leaning more towards America now. He's banking on his, in quotes, personal ties with Trump. Abke bar, and Trump calls Modi his friend, and Modi calls Trump his friend. But let's see how this friendship will work out. But I think see hard days ahead because the international system is based on confidence in the dollar. If that confidence goes, you'll have a severe meltdown. Whether we can absorb a meltdown like we absorbed 2008 and 1998 before that, I'm not sure. This time it could be a bigger meltdown.
That's true. I think it is inevitable that declining power will resist, but that's as quite a few experts have said, it's a decline that will take place, and I don't think the dollar will ever get back to its primacy. Vidya, how do you look at the Trump administration's foreign policy? There seems to be a fair amount of mixed signals or paradoxes that are emerging. Right in the beginning, he started threatening, including use of military force to get what he wants in Greenland, uh, threatening Canada to become a 51st state of the US, and of course, Panama Canal. And what has happened in Colombia when Colombia refused to take the immigrant planes there, and then he said, I'll swap more taxes. And Colombia's weakness came out simply because they were using the dollar as their own national currency. And that, showed up the weakness, and he backed down. So Trump probably feels that all strategies are going to work very well. But this is going to shake up the whole world significantly if Trump goes along in this same way. And how do you see Trump dealing with Putin or the West Asian crisis? And what would that impact in the larger, context of the US still wanting to retain its hegemony? I believe the insecurity of losing out that hegemony is actually showing up, just like any declining power will show up in their actions, the last actions that actually show up. So the few elements that came out very recently from China. One is the flying of the sixth generation prototypes in end of December, and now, of course, the DeepSeek, artificial intelligence tool. Both have literally shaken the foundations of American technological supremacy to a significant extent. And also the capitalism that's gone overboard and it's become actually oligarchic control. That seems to be getting exposed significantly with these two particular events that the Chinese have released. And they seem to have timed it very well. So how do you look at these developments?
So I'll take pieces of what you just talked about, and on some I'll defer to Jerry. One is the rhetoric and the reality. If you think in terms of Robert Putnam's two-level games, Trump is simultaneously trying to play his domestic audience and negotiate with his foreign interlocutors. And his domestic audience is pretty divided, because if you're looking at the core MAGA supporters, they want him to improve their standard of living, to bring down inflation. And then he's got another constituency that is the business elite, and their interests run, they don't necessarily align with the interests of the core MAGA supporters. And so he's somehow got to balance this. And I think part of his rhetoric is trying to appeal to his MAGA supporters while leaving enough room to shift his positions. And so he's got this very interesting game going on, where if anything goes wrong, he says it's the deep state. Or for instance, with that airplane crash, he said, oh, it's DEI hires that led to this crash, without anything really to support his assertions. And so it goes back to the point you made earlier, which is that when there's no ideology, you can pretty well say anything, take anything back, throw things against the wall, see what sticks. And you're seeing this both in his foreign policy and his domestic politics. So immigration is a big issue. And I think with Colombia in particular, he came out a winner. And I think Guruswamy talked about this. I mean, Trump sees everything in terms of wins and losses. And anyone caving into Trump is a win for him. He's a deal maker. Now, it's one thing to win against Colombia. It's going to be much more difficult against China, for instance, and to some extent, even Mexico and Canada. So a couple of things here, and that is in response to the points you raised. One is the economics and the geopolitics. They are connected. And in many ways, Trump's positions economically are going to undercut US interests geopolitically. To what extent is he going to be able to recognize this and bring them in alignment? And he has to be subtle and strategic about it, two qualities that he does not have. The other point I want to make is in terms of soft power. Guruswamy talked about the primacy of the dollar and the soft power that it has earned the United States over the years, and ways in which that is declining. The other area of soft power is humanitarian aid. One of the first things he did is freeze it. And that has undercut US initiatives in countries around the world and opened space for China, I think, to ply its influence. In terms of geopolitics, all of his appointees are China hawks, whether it's Rubio as Secretary of State or Mike Waltz. And so are his blandishments against India going to undercut him geopolitically against China? So there are a whole host of contradictions, and how those contradictions are going to be resolved remains to be seen. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Jerry, would you want to add to that? Or let me ask particularly a pointed question. Is Trump a threat to America, the Republic, or America, the democracy?
Well, first of all, a caveat. As someone who spent most of my adult life trying to tell students and other captive audiences that it's not only possible but probable that intelligent persons of goodwill will have fundamental disagreements with regard to public policies. Well, I have to admit that over the course of the last decade or so, it has become much more difficult to become balanced and fair in this regard. For instance, my particular reading of Donald Trump himself, and by the way, I might mention that it's quite interesting to me that in a discussion of the United States and its position in the world, we have become very preoccupied with an individual, Donald Trump. And we've seen what we might call the personalization of policies. But anyway, perhaps I'm being unfair, but to me, what motivates Donald Trump is a combination of ignorance, malice, prejudice, and self-regard. And with regard to a majority of his supporters, they are motivated by some mixture of this ignorance, malice, prejudice, self-regard, and some measure of dishonesty, and perhaps, to be a little bit more fair, calculation, in the sense that Donald Trump seems to be a convenient vehicle for their particular interests, whether they may be economic, social, religious, ideological, whatever that may be. And of course, obviously, in this area, there is a large spillover between foreign and domestic issues. But one thing that we can look forward to, I believe, over the course of the next 4 years is that with regard to Trump's approach, it is going to be performative rather than a substantive to governance. To use a simile here, we might say that it's like grabbing and pulling levers that may be labeled in general terms, such as tariffs, tax cuts, grants, federal workforce, whatever. We pull that lever with practically a total disregard for the specific consequences and outcomes that may be there. So, to sum up, for the rest of the world, what do you do? Well, to a large extent, it would depend on your level of relative vulnerability to the actions of the United States. I would say that the best overall approach would be caution. Now, one could be cynical, and we have already seen this to a certain extent. You might play to Mr. Trump's self-regard, flattery, what we might term actual bribery, some level of self-abnegation. In other words, Trump always is right, he always wins. Or one could be confrontational and, to the extent possible, inflict economic pain on the United States. I would suggest that perhaps on an individual and a group level, one could form unofficial and perhaps official alliances with U.S. public and private elites. These are individuals and groups who are influential either because of their positions in the economic structure or perhaps personally. But to reiterate what I just said, for the rest of the world, be cautious.
Thank you, Jerry. I'll come back to you. A lot to discuss on the democracy part and the Republican part later. Vijay, I just want to raise one major issue. The US has wielded its power, being the largest or the most powerful military power in the world. As I pointed out, the Chinese test flying of the sixth generation fighter prototypes, the design looks extremely interesting. And it also demonstrates their leapfrogging in many of the critical technology domains. They are going hammer and tongs at the space dominance. And today, the shipbuilding, seven of the world's biggest shipyards are in China. And they have, as per the last count, 370 ships as against the Americans' 294. And by middle of 2030s, the Chinese will have something close to 450 ship navy, with probably 5 aircraft carriers and 6th generation platforms flying off them. And so the American military budget, if you include the homeland security and the external and the military spending, it's about $1.3 trillion to $1.5 trillion. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to sustain that kind of an expenditure. And but Trump continually refers to the use or the threat of use of military power to achieve his objectives, as he just now commented against Greenland and Denmark and Canada and Panama. How does this will play out with respect to the American hegemony in the next 2-3 decades? And what will be Trump's contribution or disruption in this?
Thank you. Very, very relevant questions. And let me try and address these. But before that, let me put out a few ideas that I have, which I thought will be useful. And I'll come down to, what the issues that you have raised, Marshal. Well, I think, we got a good flavor of what's in his mind. I think it can be summed up disruptive. I mean, he's going to disrupt everything, and that sent a lot of stakeholders into a TC in terms of, they're worried, there's anxiety, how he's going to play out. There is also this belief that, it's like nationalism, like the MAGA, the whole slogan part of it. And Jay Shankar promptly, responded to that, American nationalist. I mean, fair enough. I think that's the flavor of the time, that you have to play to the domestic audience. The gallery is very, very important. What has brought him into for the second term. I think it's fair in those many terms. But then when it unfolds in terms of foreign and security policies, I think that's where it worries us. Of course, he's waded into very difficult areas. Things like we're talking about national sovereignty. Canada is talking about Greenland, Panama Canal. I think they're very sensitive issues. That probably has given a kind of an idea of what next. I am not surprised tomorrow when he gets up in the morning and he says, it's no more Pacific Ocean, it's America's ocean. So there is something called, cartographic imaginations that he has, which are coming out in terms of his mind, what he's thinking about. Another thing that worries me is that, is he pushing certain countries to this block called the CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Now, anybody who's weak, economically weak, politically weak, they would be gravitating towards this bloc. And while he may be maverick in his approach, but then I think he's pushing certain constituencies towards that. And we have a very good example about, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. I mean, they were labeled as troika of tyranny, of course, by John Bolton. He's not there anymore, not in the part of the team as of now. But then I guess that the strands of this still exist. Another thing that worries me is what about Pakistan, our neighbor? We talk much about China. Now, that's where has Pakistan been put into a kind of a front line of, in the form of that you push it hard, where will it go? And I see signs of Pakistan gravitating towards Russia. China, of course, they are very much in the lap of Chinese. But then Russia is another entrant. What probably gets us thinking is that I think that was his envoy for special mission, and he put out a very interesting kind of an argument, and he's drawn parallel with persecution of Trump by Biden administration and brought in Imran Khan with the present dispensation. Now, what is this all leading to? Then, of course, there is some talk about revival of TAPI, that is the Turkmenistan, Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline. No, the energy, kind of architecture which is shaping up is another very, very fascinating kind of, formulation which is taking place. Coming back to shipbuilding, well, I think the Americans missed the bus. The Chinese probably, have taken off. And looking at the capacities and capabilities in terms of mass production, and those of us who've been to their, shipbuilding sites, we find that it's like, a series production. They have no problems about it. But as far as sophistication is concerned, I think I'll still go with the Americans to that extent. They are sophisticated. They have been testing it out there, testing out their equipment. The Chinese have less experience. Of course, they've shown us their, what I would call as logistic supply chains, being deployed way back, almost 8-9 years into Gulf of Aden. But they haven't seen that kind of a combat for that. So that would be something that will be. Of course, the military-industrial complex, I think it still goes in that direction with the Americans. There are no competing, budgets. You mentioned about the budget. Well, today there's a capacity. Sustaining will be certainly an issue. But then the edge that the Americans enjoy across the globe, the footprint, their ability to sustain, right? Now, the very fact that they're talking about, agreements with, or kind of arrangements with India, in terms of maintenance, MROs. I think these are all consolidating, whether it's during the Biden administration or otherwise. I think the Americans are consolidated. We can't get back home to get our repairs. We have to be forward deployed for that now. I think that will continue. To me, I guess this will be a great area. And what does it mean for us as far as India is concerned? I don't see anything change much as far as the military is concerned. The exercises will continue. I think it will be the top partnership in terms of number of exercises. I don't see any quarrels on that. Of course, there will be certain conditions which will now emerge. We'll see. A middle path will have to be found out. Atmanirbhar Bharat, co-development, co-production, transfer of technology, and there is this MAGA again, Make America Great Again. I think that is where there will be convergences. I think a middle path will be found. Overall, I see for India, as far as the military establishment is concerned, I think there are opportunities for both sides. India needs tech investment. America needs a market. I think the middle path probably will be out. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. I think that's both need each other. I think we need to find where we actually can benefit each other effectively. Ambassador Sood, let me come to this issue of international relations, international institutions. Giving the devil its due, some of the statements can actually be seen from a different perspective. He says he wants peace, he doesn't want war, and he'll stop all wars. That's the statement he made in the inaugural president. And then his way of dealing with Putin, again, a paradox. He sends out a literal warning, stop the war immediately, otherwise we'll throw sanctions. And Putin actually dismissed it with his usual flair. And so how does he look at from the lens of everything as a businessman in a transactional framework? He's not a fan of multilateralism, and therefore will he deal more with bilateral approach? Europe economy was pretty much, I would say, decimated by the war that was started by the NATO and the US and the Biden regime. Will he reverse that trend? And what will happen to NATO? In that context, then what are the implications of his walking out of the Paris Climate Agreement? And what does that do for India, which is a heavily dependent country on fossil fuels? It makes sense for us to move away from fossil fuels and move towards a renewable energy regime. But America, he wants to actually leverage his strength in fossil fuels. Is there going to be problems in these areas?
As I mentioned, I mean, since there is no ideology, he often takes positions that are mutually inconsistent. I mean, on one hand, he would like his core support the the white working class, who've not been able to improve their skills and so on. I mean, they are relying on him to cut taxes. They are relying on him to reduce inflation, cutting tax, and also reduce prices. Obviously, that is how inflation will come down. Now, if he's going to increase tariffs, the US economy, the way it is integrated, if he's going to increase tariffs, how is he going to reduce prices? Because he also wants to cut taxes. He can't increase taxes. So there are various contradictions, and that is why, whereas the tech bros, this as the term has been used in recent days, I mean, those are people who are great believers in globalization. Now, he obviously has walked out of multilateral groupings, whether it is the Paris Accord, whether it is WHO, whether it is XYZ, and we'll see more of that. Last time he had also emasculated WTO by refusing to, their appellate tribunal was, they had only one person left there, so it could not even meet. So he prefers to be able to deal with countries one by one, because obviously that puts him in a more advantageous position. Because vis-a-vis any country, whether it is a Canada or whether it is Russia or whether it is Ukraine or whether it is an India or whether it is European, whether it is France or Germany or whatever, it makes, or South Korea, it puts him in an advantageous position. But then he is completely reversing the whole idea that the US strength lies in the fact that it has a global appeal or it has global alliances or things like, which is why it has something like 700 bases all over the world. So somewhere there will be a contradiction which will come up. Whether that happens within his tenure or whether that happens after his 4 years are over, I don't know. But clearly, many of the people who are backing him, let's say, okay, he has hijacked the Republican Party. But we'll see after 2 years when the midterms take place, how much of it has he been able to achieve? Because if his core base feels that he has let them down, prices haven't come down, inflation hasn't come down, then we'll see a reversal in 2 years' time. He may lose the Congress, he may lose the Senate. If his tech bros find that his anti-globalization policies are hurting their bottom line, they'll back out. I mean, their interest is not in, they're supporting him because they think that because they love the idea of cutting taxes. I mean, that's the whole point. He is against that minimum global tax. So they love all of that part. But then his policies are mutually inconsistent. And you can't, I mean, by dealing with countries one by one, as it were, you are not going to make friends with them. And I think that is where the difference is. So he would like, he obviously hates multipolarity. He would like to reduce it to a bipolar system. That's why I come back to what I said earlier, that the big challenge will be whether will he be able to do a deal with China? Because a deal with China, which he can say, oh, see, I told you I could manage the relationship with with Xi. Now that would create a kind of an informal G2. But that would also mean that he would have to concede a certain sphere of influence to China, which would make the rest of Asia Pacific extremely nervous. And at what cost would that G2 happen? That would be the most important element to kind of watch, because as I said, he is not interested, and you agreed that he's not interested in war. Certainly, he doesn't have the stomach for it. He wants to cut down government spending in that sense. He wants to reduce government spending budgets, that whole Doge thing that he is talking about. When he thinks he can take $3 trillion of government expenditure out, and that is how he'll get the surplus, it will give him the space to reduce taxes and so on and so on. I mean, this is a very difficult kind of thing. I mean, there are some guys in his team who think that income tax should be abolished and tariffs will make up the revenue. So it's a bizarre, it's voodoo economics and voodoo foreign policy that he is trying to. Now, how long he can survive this, or whether the, the question is, will the institutions reflect any resilience, whether it is the Fed or Republican conservative? After all, there is a backbone of Republicans. Now, so far, they relied on him as their election mascot. But sooner or later, they'll realize that we are completely losing out. And then what happens? So I think the first 2 years is where the decisions are going to get taken. And the answer to, so whether it is the China thing or whether it is his domestic base. And if we find that he is unable to do a deal with China, if his domestic base starts fracturing, then his last 2 years will be just, that is where the resistance is going to come.
That's true. Absolutely. And it's very interesting, voodoo economics and voodoo foreign policies. Mohan, let me come to that part. If there's a study that came out very recently, immediately after Trump's election, by one of the Vietnam-based, not Vietnam origin economist. She lives in the US. And she did the calculations. If a 10% tariff is imposed on China, and of course, China sort of upstaged the whole thing by imposing and banning export of critical materials to the US, which actually has shaken the bar. But 10% tariff on China will actually end up harming the consumers in the US itself. And it may impact the Southeast Asian and Vietnam and Taiwan particularly, because they'll be affected most. China will not get affected, one, she says very clearly. And because India's export to the US is still, a small percentage of its overall GDP, India is pretty much immune to any of these actions that will impact on it. So how do you actually look at Trump? And he's been quite soft, actually. He's not like belligerent like the last time with respect to China. He's actually been saying, I don't want to impose tariff, but at the same time, he's being forced to impose tariff.
Yeah, so if you notice, yeah, he has been shifting on China from, it is not like a consistent policy of what exactly he wants, which is what lends me to kind of suspect that he would be happiest if he could get some kind of a deal. Yeah. And a deal that he can say, see, I told you, I can do a deal with anybody and I can show that I win. Now, and if the Chinese are smart, they will let him have the optics that he has, whatever, as long as they get what they want. And the Chinese would like the US to concede a certain sphere of influence, stop meddling around in Taiwan, and at the same time, remove some of the technology restrictions, and that's it. And which the tech fellows may not be averse to. I mean, NVIDIA has lost a huge chunk of its market. So this is where the difficulty is, and that will enable the Chinese to accommodate him a little bit on trade issues. So he can then say, see, I reduced inflation. Now, what does that do to the rest of the world, particularly in Asia Pacific? And that would be, in a sense, from our point of view, a bad outcome. Let's put it clearly. And so a lot of where we've been putting all our eggs, we'll have to kind of rethink. And that is why I think personally, the softening up of the positions between October, where Prime Minister Modi met Xi Jinping in Kazan, from there on to the meetings between the defense ministers, foreign ministers, NSAs as special representatives in December, and now the foreign secretary. And, you know, although if you compare the statements, there are still nuances between them, but at least there seems to be a move to move things forward. So we would like to be seen as successfully straddling, as it were. And of course, I mean, to an extent, Prime Minister Modi is a great believer that he is a great diplomat himself. He is the finest diplomat. He can convince I mean, he believes in a personalized style of diplomacy. That is his conviction. And we have enough evidence during the last 10 years that he's tried it. Whether it was with Nawaz Sharif, whether it was with Obama, whether it was with Trump, whether it was with Macron, whether it was with Xi Jinping. Now, sometimes it has worked, sometimes it hasn't worked. And there is enough evidence of it to go around on either side. It depends on how you want to look at it. I don't think there is a convincing evidence of saying that, oh, it works. But so it's a question of how we look at it. And there is talk that he's now looking for an early visit to Washington. So we'll see what happens.
Very well put. Yeah, Mohan, now, what would you comment on this issue in terms of the paradoxical positions that Trump takes, and then what would actually be played out in reality with respect to economics? As a businessman, is he more on a firmer ground? You have to unmute yourself, Mohan.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very difficult to forecast. These people, they are people like Trump and Modi are creatures of a political mood in their countries. Now, Trump is not the bandmaster who plays the tune. There's a band which is playing a tune, and you're waving your hands about. That mood is in Middle America, where they see the old America which they knew, where you got paid $15 or $16 an hour to make hamburgers and sell them. Not there anymore. That is disappearing. So they would like to keep that primacy. And here in India, we are going even further down in the back when we look for make India great. We're looking at a history which probably never was there, or we're not very sure about golden age, about a golden greatness. And we are doing it by victimizing our own minorities. But whether you can orchestrate a different mood, I don't know. I'm not sure whether Trump has it. He's not a charismatic leader in that way. He's not a leader in the mold of a Roosevelt or even a Jack Kennedy. So whether he can do it, I'm not sure. He has found this formula which they arrived at, make America great, very successful politically. But it is something which will burn them from taking, because it does not allow them to take realistic decisions. The realistic decisions, of course, would be to try to balance your budget, try to limit your spending, try to curb your proclivity to print dollars. The US credit limit has now gone up to $45 trillion, their own internal credit limit. So, which means that they will only print more dollars. And as long as that is there, you are deflating the dollar all over the world. So, more dollars printed means it's worthless. And if it's worth less, then you'll keep less of it as your reserve currency. So whatever happens, America's primacy is going to be challenged, is going to be questioned, and it will whittle away. I think the world is in the world interest not to prevent them, is to prevent a meltdown, to prevent a sudden, but you can't stop the historical process. The Chinese are showing again and again that it is possible for them to make things in record time, make things of great sophistication, of complexity, whether it is electric cars or whether it's the space station. They've shown again and again that they can do it at a fraction of the cost and at a fraction of the time. If you go to Tianjin, if you see that the whole city they built in less than a year, it's quite remarkable. Now, the Chinese have shown that are trying to establish that their millennium has come. But of course, what is affecting the Chinese is the demography. They're going to age. Already, the number of old people is increasing every year. In the next 5 years, the number of people they have over 60 will be getting close to Japan's. So we are in an interesting position. India had a great chance of a demographic dividend, which we didn't harness. We didn't invest in education. We didn't invest in training. So whether India can take advantage of this, I'm not sure now. Whether we've missed the bus is what we should wonder about. So I don't think anybody like a Trump or a Xi are, in that sense, a Yoga Purush, a man who's going to change the world. Societies are restructured very differently now. The amount of technology, the amount of resources society has is vastly increased. So I think this is a big drama being played out. The inevitable change will come when, there'll be 2 or 3 countries 50 years from now or 40 years from now who will be among the top 3 or 4. Whether India will be there in the top 5 is what we should be worried about or concerned about. There's Indonesia rising fast. There is whether some country in Africa will rise, or whether ASEAN will join together to form one economic political bloc to rise. We're not sure, but all kinds of things can happen. But China, India, and America are now the 3 fixed poles. Geographic. How Europe is going to be much smaller now. 50 years from now, Russia, for instance, will be 2/3 of what it is now, of aged people. Already, they are not able to spare manpower for Ukraine. It will happen all over Europe. Now, Angela Merkel was importing migrants from the Middle East. The new German chancellor wants to end it. And Merkel had her eyes on the economics, and she said we need a younger population and we need a working class. Whereas if Germany is going to go back to make Germany great again, what will happen to it economically, one doesn't know. We'll have to see. I think we are living in very interesting times. I say it in that Chinese sense of it. It means that, it's going to be very difficult times.
Great. Vijay, what would you see the future of Indo-Pacific and the AUKUS in the context of Trump's approach to military alliances and defense, particularly?
Well, I guess, there's a probing, activity on. The Russians are probing the Atlantic. The Chinese are probing the Pacific. Each one is testing out. And I think that will be a very big challenge for the Trump administration in those many terms, particularly the US military. What I noticed, Arctic is going to be one center of gravity, which will attract attention in terms of, trade, the Russians dominating it, the whole coastline, the Chinese making what they call as Arctic Belt Road or whatever they want to call it. So that area is going to be problematic for the Americans, because if you really look at the number of icebreakers which the Russians have, is very large compared to the US, Canada combined, the Nordic countries. So that is going to be one element which probably is going to be played out in favor of the Russians. The Chinese are also pitching in for building. After all, they are leaders in terms of shipbuilding. For them, it doesn't take long to, maybe 2-3 years from now, you'll have at least half a dozen Chinese built icebreakers available to the Russians. That only adds to the kitty. So to that extent, I think Arctic waters or Arctic ice is going to be one of the important areas where, the Guig Gap, as we know traditionally, they will be probing into the Atlantic. Pacific, I noticed the Russians are going to be coming back into it in a big way, coming from the Far East, Vladivostok as a takeoff point. That will be one area. I don't see much of things happening in the broader Indian Ocean. So there is also this tendency to, club the two, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. I think the security complexes are totally different. And that is where, flawed strategies emerge as to, in terms of what would be the Indo-Pacific strategy. So I find that the Chinese are going to get more and more concentrated towards the Pacific. They will make their usual port calls, etc., the BRI, the deployment in the Gulf of Aden. But to my mind, they would be probing, they would be getting into the Arc. That is one area they would like to work on, and they will have the support of the Russians in this country. So what I see is also there will be investments being made in terms of joint, military collaboration in terms of, let's say, military hardware. We'll have to watch how does a combined military-industrial complex of Russia and China shapes. That is something to be watched. What kind of platforms are they going to be looking? Each one brings it their own kind of capacities and capabilities. They're brilliant. They are the Chinese in terms of, let's say, shipbuilding, platform production, mass production. The Russians, for that matter, bringing in their capacities. The hypersonic, we've just got a glimpse of it. How will they tie up? How does North Korea get into it? What is Iran's capacity in terms of, the entire unmanned aviation, the smaller ones, etc. So these are all going to be something. Would they come together to create another military-industrial complex of their own, bringing in their capacities? This is something probably as scholars probably, or also military specialists probably will have to watch out as to where this whole group is going and how does Europe fit into the larger American military industrial complex. It's just going to be selling. The Trump is only thinking about selling or asking them build it up in terms of your defenses, in terms of their budgets. So these are some of things that how the probably we missed out a very, very important component called the Europeans. I mean, much of the focus of discussion has been towards the Chinese, for that matter, the Russians. I think Europe is going to be a very, very important factor in our schema when we look at how Trump plays out with respect to various geographies that he has in. I'll stop it.
Thank you, Vijay. And Vidya, let me, before that, let me tell the audience, please raise your hand or put up your questions on the chat box to intervene and participate in the discussions. I was wanting to look at what's the future of the Ukraine, war in Ukraine, and what's the future of NATO in the context of NATO. And let me add Christian Kloberger's question also, which is in the same lines. How can we keep talking about rule-based international order when the leader of the most powerful country and supposed major supporter of it threatens the territorial integrity of independent countries based on geopolitical interests? And how can we reject similar statements coming from other leaders? What about European leaders and the leaders of the EU supporting the rule-based international order, all of which keep silent on Trump's threats to the national sovereignty of independent countries? Again, what values left with the phrase of rule-based international order? Vidya?
I think those are very legitimate questions. And I think the hypocrisy about the rules-based order doesn't start with Trump. If you think in terms of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, for instance, or other elective wars in which the U.S. has engaged, the Russians and Chinese have consistently pointed out the hypocrisy of this rules-based order. On the other hand, I mean, some of the other points I'd like to raise have to do with this concern over Chinese military platforms and so forth. And I can't remember who the speaker was who made the point that the Chinese are not battle tested. And how they would actually perform in a war remains to be seen. The other point I'd like to make is there was a question in the chat about, is China going to be emboldened to take over Taiwan? I think much of what China is doing is trying to undermine Taiwanese independence and bind Taiwan to China economically without actually fighting a war. I think a war against Taiwan, if the Chinese had even been contemplating it, they're going to have some pause when they look at Russia's trials with Ukraine when they share a common land border. So the introduction of drone warfare, for instance, I think drones, and I'm not a military expert or strategist, so some of your other panelists may be able to address this better. Drones might make these big platforms very vulnerable, aircraft carriers, for instance, and so forth. So what is the future of warfare? What has the revolution in military affairs done? Has it provided countries with smaller budgets to develop ability to deploy countermeasures? So all of that, I think, is something we need to take into account. And I think the cost, even if the Chinese were militarily successful in a cross-strait war, pacification and post-war resources would drain China. I don't think it's going to be that easy for China to absorb Taiwan were they to try to do it through war. And finally, about NATO, I think the raison d'etre for NATO after the Soviet collapse was already in question. And I think subsequent developments have increasingly pointed to the natural attenuation of any impact NATO may have. In other words, which is the country that is being targeted by NATO? To what extent might the Americans have undermined their own interests through NATO expansion? These are all questions I think one needs to address. And finally, I'll just say one thing. The National Security Archives have recently declassified what is called the Merry cable. And this was a cable that Wayne Merry had sent to the State Department through the Dissent channel on what he saw as very incorrect policies toward Russia that undermined the liberal political forces in Russia in the 1990s.
Great. Yeah. Jerry, let me ask, being a Vietnam War veteran, and the US has consistently been involved in wars across the world, and with its 750 bases around the world, it's been a way of disrupting where probably something could threaten the US hegemony and then keep that region under disruption is the way I look at it. But many across the world now look at military industrial complexes being largely responsible to continue to have their businesses, to have wars across the world. Well, how do you think Trump is going to deal with it? That's one. The second one is the founding fathers of the American Constitution looked at the nation to be a republic controlled by elites making the larger decisions. And they were not in favor of full-fledged democracy where people will make the decisions. But by the late 19th century, the democracy got entrenched. Is the democracy hugely in decline? And as Benjamin Franklin, when somebody asked him, what do you think of the Constitution? And he says it's a republic if you can keep it. Is the republic over?
Well, first of all, to respond to your first question, I would, and I believe this was dealt with peripherally by a couple of previous speakers. Looking at it in general terms, every war that the United States has been involved in since the Second World War has been a matter of choice. What we might term there has been considerable, I would say, disagreement with regard to the official position of the United States with regard to, say, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and other instances, whether in fact those situations constituted a basic threat to the security of the United States. I would say that in the context of the Cold War, it was easier for the policymaking elites to justify American interventions in this particular regard. But I would say that in an overall sense, since that time, and the demise of what we might term the bipolar world, this argument has become more and more difficult to make. To a certain extent, and I'll grossly oversimplify here, to a certain extent, we might say that this particular situation is fed by the growth of what President Eisenhower termed the military-industrial complex. And that is that we have an enormous amount of our national resources that have a basic interest in the continuation of the militarization of the United States to an extent that we never saw until the Second World War. With regard to your second question about democracy and republic and this sort of thing, I presume that with republic, we're talking about the specifically American definition of a republic, that is a representative democracy. That is a situation where the institutions of your government are staffed and controlled by individuals and groups of individuals who in a general way represent the viewpoint and the interests of the population as a whole. Obviously, if you look at the beginning of our the brief history of the United States, there was a basic distrust of the people when you look at the institutions of under the original Constitution. The one major institution that even approached representing the people was the U.S. House of Representatives. Since that time, when you look at the constitutional history of the United States, we have seen efforts to broaden the electorate and in democratic terms, that is, giving a direct voice to larger and larger segments of our population. Now, to sum up, I would say that with regard, I would say that when you look at the history of the United States in particular and the world in general, constitutions, laws, regulations, these we might argue are a necessary component to a republic, but they are not sufficient. And if nothing else, what we are seeing emerging right now in Trump 2.0 is the fact that constitutions, laws, regulations in and of themselves do not form a protection of the people against an arbitrary government. What the necessary component is individuals filling these positions who are willing to carry out the will of the people and to protect the Constitution and the laws.
Thank you, Jerry. Ambassador wants to comment. Go ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you. Very brief comment. I just wanted to, it is true that the Chinese military has not been tested. But I would just venture to say that the US military has only, the last war they won was the Second World War.
Even
And
that
after
is
that, while they have been
contestable.
while they have been involved in many wars, I don't think that you could actually call their intervention or whatever to be very successful. So, despite their superiority of technology, etc., you know, all of it, whether it is Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Vietnam or Korean War is also at a stalemate after all, since 1953. So, I mean, the US record has also been slightly not very reassuring, shall we say.
Absolutely.
And the second thing I wanted to mention was that, you know, this liberal international rule-based order, this is a term that was first used by Eikenberry
John
and
Aiken.
the IR professor. You know, but during the Cold War, you did not hear this term because there was no international rule-based order. There was a Western order where the rules were written by the Western hegemon, which was the United States. And with the end of the Cold War, and I wouldn't even say that the Cold War was necessarily a US victory, I would say it was a US victory by default because the other fellow collapsed.
Mm.
I think we now know enough about Soviet internal economic situation, political situation, to realize that it was the internal collapse which led to the victory in the Cold War. But of course, the conventional narrative on that has been that the US won the Cold War. So it is declared as a victory. And I think it is that notion that leads to the hubris, where suddenly what was the Western order gets translated by Eikenberry and a whole host of other people who are willing to take on that and call it the liberal international rule-based order. It never was designed as a liberal international rule-based order. So sorry, I just wanted to emphasize this.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's the even the Second World War, the many would now say largely won by the Soviet or the Russians. Without their actions, nothing much could have happened to defeat Germany. We have Captain Gangara. Would you ask a question? And then we have two more people.
So that's a question that was already, I put it on the chat regarding Taiwan. I had asked whether, China would get emboldened after seeing what's the events in. I think that's already been replied by Professor Vidya. She's already replied to it. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Devendra Kumar, would you?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for the opportunity. A small comment. For example, the Cold War, as sir has suggested, as one actor may have collapsed. But in my opinion, but the Cold War is still going on. The actors have changed, the tactics have changed, but it's still remaining. As far as the Trump is concerned, I see the three approaches that the Trump 2.0 has brought to the world. The one is as was highlighted during his election campaign, that the isolationist approach that United States would be much more domestically focused with Department of Government Efficiency, cutting first, this, that, and many countries have fallen into this. And there's been a cap which has come up that we will review everything and then we'll reinstate the funding. The second approach could be the confrontational approach, as Matheswaran sir has already highlighted, basically to sustain the military-industrial complex of United States by changing the name. Mexican Gulf would be American Gulf, and then challenging, taking on from the Trump 1.0, the confrontation or the trade war with the Chinese by saying that we want to take back the Panama. And third, it can be a question also to Rakesh sir, what I see the approach or his personal ambition, that if he doesn't want war, is he eyeing for the Nobel Peace Prize? Thank you, sir.
I'll take a few more, the remaining questions, and then hand over to the panelists. Yeah, Balarama, what is your question?
Good morning, Cham. So myself, Balarama, a student of Reva, studying political science. So my question would be, like, as Trump comes to power, he wants the NATO members to increase their budget spending to up to 5%. Already European members are facing economic crisis. So European unions, especially France, is looking is strengthening ties with China. As Dr. Sakhuja mentioned about although China is having a good amount of naval things, but they're not having experience in some technologies. But even France is well known for their technologies, although they don't have a huge naval ships, but they are very good at naval warfare, all these technologies. So my concern is about what if China is strengthening its ties with France and getting their technologies to build better naval ships in Hainan or South China Sea. My question would be to the delegates of United States. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Christian, Dr. Christian.
It's more a comment, if you allow me.
Yeah, please.
Response to Ambassador Rakesh. Yes, no question. During the Cold War, rule-based international order was no issue. But considering the last couple of years, almost every statement by Western leaders, by the EU, by the US, was focusing on it. So therefore, whenever it gets more undermined, it should be emphasized. This was my intervention to it. So this one not because whenever any formal statement is related, oh, look, the rule-based international order is undermined, but it was undermined before, and like what Trump is doing now, it's hugely, I would say, hugely significant because it just makes such a big push of undermining it. So that's just the response to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christian. I'll start with Ambassador Rakesh Sood. You can take on the questions and give your concluding remarks. We'll just go on.
Yeah, yes, I'll do that. There was a question that was posed by, I think, Dr. Devendra Kumar. If you could just repeat. I think he posed a specific direct question, wasn't it?
Taiwan. Yes.
I meant was, like, sir, you had mentioned that he doesn't want war, but if you look at his approach, he's following the confrontational approach. There's a Taiwan is one, Panama, he's challenging the Chinese. So it was just a small query.
Okay. Understood. Okay, got it. Well, first of all, I think this is an interesting thing that Dr. Ploberger raised from the beaches of Thailand. But let me say, which makes me sitting in Delhi extremely envious. But what I wanted to say was, it's, the rule-based international, liberal international rule-based order has been a myth. The fact that people blindly, everybody talked about a rule-based order does not necessarily, I mean, this is like the story of the king and the boy saying, oh, the king is naked. I mean, I remember more than 10 or 12 years ago in the Foreign Affairs magazine, this US political scientist, Graham Allison, who's famous for the Thucydides trap.
Right.
He has an article, a long article where he says, a liberal international rule-based order was a myth. And in fact, one of the other US political scientists, he said, the end of the Cold War, the US had convinced itself that it had won the Cold War, and then it hung around the wrestling, then it hung around the boxing ring like a punch-drunk boxer looking for an opponent. And everybody clapped and everybody said, yes, there is a liberal international rule-based order. Who agreed to it? And I think we are paying the price for the wars today. And mind you, in my personal assessment, the US would love to have a bipolar, because that is the way it can keep its allies together. Because the bipolar world forces them to make choices. It becomes extremely difficult for the US to, because by definition, every single ally is a junior partner. Go back to the Cold War. Every single ally of the United States is a junior partner. For 30 years that we've been trying to engage in a dialogue with the United States, the basic challenge has been to find a way of making the US realize that we are neither an ally nor an adversary. So you have to engage with us, India, as a partner, neither an ally nor an adversary, because the US would like to see things in black and white. Adversary, no, but Trump, because he doesn't have that kind of a mentality of getting into a conflict in long term, and of course the US-China relationship is very different from the US-Soviet relationship during the Cold War for obvious reasons, which I need not dwell on, because I think everybody knows that. Therefore, we are not very clear as to how that Cold War, I mean, I don't think we are today necessarily in a Cold War with China, or the US is necessarily in a Cold War with China. And so therefore, if we want to have a liberal rule-based international order, I think we have to start de novo. And therefore, which is why it is so eroded, which is why the existing multilateral institutions seem to be so helpless and hamstrung. So that's where the problem is. I mean, I think I've taken up enough time, but I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think the G2 is really, I would see it as a threat. What really required is, I think we didn't have much time to discuss the BRICS, but multipolar world order is certainly the way to look at having a rules base, which I call as a rationalized world order, having every major power playing their role. Mohan, your concluding remarks? Mohan?
Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Vijay?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'll try to make it very short. Like I said earlier, we live in interesting times, very difficult to predict. We never learn from our history, and we will continue to make new history. And history seldom repeats itself. So I think Mr. Trump is entitled to a set of mistakes. Some of them could be very big, profound, if he acts out on what he's talking about. But knowing Trump, a lot of it is bluff. I think the US establishment also will not allow him to get away with it. Already his choice of cabinet officers has been challenged in Congress and by Republicans. And increasingly, this would keep increasing. So whether this primacy and this new honeymoon period where he's getting away with saying all kinds of things and doing all kinds of things, he will last for very long. So if the tariffs start biting, as they will, then, we'll have to see there'll be a new Trump. He'd be domestically wounded and winged, and the by-elections and the midterm elections would show us that. If that happens, then we'll get back to normal again. The process of US loss of primacy has to be a gradual one in the interest of the world order and a steady one. And any precipitate way of trying to bring it down is not going to succeed.
Thank you.
The Chinese, above all, realize this.
Yeah. Vidya and Jay, your final comments?
I just want to make two very quick comments. One is that with regard to the US-China relationship, most of his security establishment is full of China hawks. And so any idea that we're going to develop some sort of a condominium or a G2 is probably not going to happen very easily. The other comment I would like to make, and this is with respect to the wars that the United States has fought and lost, rightly as it was pointed out, is that none of those defeats were military defeats. They were political defeats. And that is something that China would need to take into account as well. Winning the military phase of the war does not assure a political victory. And this is one of the points that Kissinger made, that the United States is very good at winning wars and just as good at losing the peace.
Jerry? Jerry, your comments? Yeah.
You have.
Yes, just one final word of caution with regard to what I said about democracy and representative democracy and republics is that with regard to the United States, we can provide a lesson to the world with regard to the necessity of having people fill our positions of authority who are really interested in the nation itself rather than themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Vijay, your final comments?
Thank you. Well, no concluding thoughts. As a matter of fact, it is work in progress. I would venture to suggest that the Peninsula Foundation should host similar kind of an event 3 months from now. Let's assess what we've talked today, what we've culled out in those many terms, our own understandings, interpretations, and future predictions. I think it'll be a good idea. Maybe 3 months from now, let's get back to the drawing board and see what would we talk about. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And this has been an excellent event. And I thank Ambassador Rakesh Sood, Dr. Mohan Guruswamy, Dr. Vidya Nadkarni, and Professor Jerry Wilkins, and Dr. Vijay Sakhuja for their exceptional contributions. And I think we need to probably take one larger issue is that the US is now clearly, all the experts say it's in the control of the oligarchs. And it seems to be many of the democracies, and I would say India included, are quite influenced by the oligarchs, and that is a danger for democracy across the world, which could also lead to a lot of conflicts over again. So thank you very much, and let me call Jnana Divya to give the word of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. As we conclude this insightful webinar, Trump 2.0 likely impact on India and the world, I take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to all who made this event a success. First and foremost, I extend my heartfelt thanks to our distinguished speakers, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy, Professor Vidya Nadkarni, Professor Jerry Wilkins, and Dr. Vijay Sakhuja for sharing their deep insights on the geopolitical and economic implications for a second Trump presidency. Your expertise has provided us with a nuanced understanding of how India and the global order may navigate this evolving political landscape. A special thanks to our esteemed moderator, Air Marshal M. Matheswaran, President of the Peninsula Foundation, for steering the discussion with clarity and precision, ensuring an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. On behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, I would like to extend a deep appreciation to Reva University for its support and for fostering academic and policy-oriented discussions. We look forward to more collaborations in the future. A big thank you to our attendees who joined us today from different parts of the world. Your engagements, questions, and participation have enriched this session and made it even more meaningful. Lastly, my sincere gratitude to our organizing team for ensuring a smooth and seamless execution for this webinar. We hope today's discussion sparks further dialogue and research in this crucial area. Thank you once again for being part of this session, and we will look forward to more such thought-provoking engagements in the future. Thank you.